Background: I am male. At the time of this experience, I was 23 years old, weighed 125 pounds, and in good mental and physical health. I take no prescription or OTC medications, but use marijuana and yerba mate on a daily basis. I have taken a variety of substances, but my major interest lies with the psychedelics. For tryptamines at the time of this experience, I had familiarity with everything from mushrooms, LSD, Hawaiian baby woodrose seeds, ayahuasca, yopo and sabile seeds, DMT, and 5-MeO-DMT. For phenethylamines, at the time of this experience, I had familiarity with various species of trichocereus cacti, 2CI, 2CE, MDMA, MDA, methylone, and some DOX blotters. I had also experimented with some dissociatives such as salvia, divinorum, nitrous oxide, ketamine, and DXM. This was by no means my first experience with DMT. I had been frequently experimenting with the substance on its own or in combination with other substances and had gained a high level of comfortability, enjoyment, and awe of the experiences possible with this substance. Set and setting: my room, alone at nighttime. I had taken a small amount of MDMA earlier in the evening and was in a mood to continue exploring altered states of consciousness. I felt the desire to smoke some DMT, and so did my usual setup ritual. Dim lighting, comfortably seated against a wall with a pillow at my back, and some calm, chill music lined up to anchor my consciousness during re-entry, the experience. As I rolled the stem of the pipe back and forth, heating, scrounging the remnants of DMT stuck to the sides of the glass vessel, I said, holding the flame and spinning the pipe, I ask to connect to my higher self. Show me something different. Show me something I haven't seen before. And then I breathed in. Once, hold, exhale. Once more, feels natural. In, hold, just a little vapor coming up the tube. There was a dull humming sound like that of an old and cranky vacuum cleaner, the kind of dull, grating mechanical noise that makes your head hurt. Every summer afternoon, ruined by lawn mowers and weed whippers, every dog terrified of the menacing, vibrating, ear-busting vacuum cleaner. This terrible, painful pressure in my skull seemed to be forcing my head downwards. I went with it, remembering how I have been directed into certain body positions before on DMT, to good effect. I was directed into a position of abasement, seeking to escape the pain. With a fanfare of trumpets, a tear opened up in the fabric of space and time. Something whispered to me that I was being brought into the presence of someone worthy of great respect and that I was privileged. Through this hole made his entrance a kind of gloating, glutinous male entity. It was this thing making that terrible humming noise. For a moment, His Majesty spoke to me, though I couldn't understand the words. It reminded me of Star Wars, A New Hope. All right, yes, I went through a Star Wars geek phase, when all the droids are in the big sand transport and moving around, squeaking and twittering and gloffing at one another. This threw me off about as much as it would throw you off if your computer started trying to communicate to you based on its own personal language derived from its binary encoding. Or maybe your computer would suddenly be speaking fluid Japanese. Surely the language of machines. Then I was back to being simply gloated over malevolently. The audience hearing was closing. That vicious pain came back inescapable this time. Something was all wrong about this. I said, "No, I will not be your servant. I will not be your servant," I cried. "Leave this space now." The pain in my head was maddening as this invisible entity latched himself onto my skull over the crown chakra and pressing in at the hollow at the base of the skull. I found my perceptions being poked and prodded, seeking to maximize the painful and fearful effect. I did not let my shifting perceptions affect my centered and collected core. I sealed off my mind, a little protected kernel at the center of all the painful, fearful sensations I was experiencing. I rode out the duration of the tryptamine flash. "You cannot break my mind. I am too powerful. I can withstand whatever you throw at me. Your mind games do not trick me." Again I cried out, "I will not be your servant." The pain in my head stepped up another notch. "This is sacred space. You cannot be here. This house is protected. You cannot be here." I pictured the diamond-shaped protection rune encircling the entire house. With finality and strength in my voice, "Leave this space now." The grip on my skull loosened and I shrugged him off, but he remained hovering in the ether, burning of Russian sage to clear the area. At first, my movements were shaky and hasty. I took the time to be calm and collected again, and then proceeded smoothly with the smudging. The dull pain was still there, tingling. This was one relentless little effort. If you try to stay, I warned him, you have not just me to face. I was thinking of two of my roommates particularly, male and female, and powerful. You will not be tolerated in this space. We will throw you out. Leave now and never come back. Still spitting venom, the treaty was made. I opened the window wide to allow his passage and watched as something I couldn't see except as maybe a slippery, oily sheen to the air slowly pulled up its foul tentacles, its trailing eyeballs and cytoplasmic brain-netting devices, and dragged its sorry ass out of my house. Hopefully he didn't slip across the street to terrorize someone else's sleep. Crap's getting serious now, boys and girls. If I wasn't so sane, I'd think I was going mad. Be careful what you wish for. Something different, something I haven't seen before. Instant manifestation. I talked about this experience with one of my roommates the next day. He explained to me that any entity that shows up during a DMT experience is an entity that I've called in. They can try any trick in the book, manipulating my perceptions and emotions, trying to get me to give them power over myself. But ultimately, they have no power of their own over us except that which we give them. Any entity which I call in must conform to my will if asked enough times and with enough strength. This is a good thing to know when entering DMT space. When interacting with entities on the energetic plane, there is no way for them to hide their intentions towards us. My intuition on this one went off. There was something ill-intentioned and malevolent about this entity. It is wise to trust your intuitions in cases like this. Beware the psychic vacuum cleaner. Not all entities in DMT space are friendly. I learned a lot from this experience. It reminded me of the importance of stating my intentions very clearly and consciously before going into the experience. A conscious statement of intent serves to focus the experience, and I can rest assured that whatever I experience will be within my intent. After this experience, I started specifically inviting only those entities who are friendly, helpful, benevolent, and of positive intention for the good of all beings. All. Prior to this incident, I have had DMT approximately 30 times, mainly using smaller doses to create a link between the molecule and myself when not under the influence of it. The DMT molecule helped me profoundly a few months after having life-changing spiritual awakening experiences while not under the influence of drugs. This conscious link with the molecule had been found, and therefore a very light dose of DMT will now send me to places that many people cannot seem to go, unless on much higher doses. This particular time, however, was a very bad trip. I experienced the furthest amount of separation a being can experience from the source. I had seen this void many times in my life before, just before fainting as a child and teenager. The last time I saw it was only weeks before I began to see deeper layers of reality on a day-to-day basis. I had never, however, seen it in such clarity. I was in a level and calm, fairly calm mood. I had never tried this particular batch of DMT before, and upon exhaling it, was quickly aware that it was very different to the types I had had before. As the visual and audio geometries and dismantling of the identity construct progressed, I became uncomfortable and began to have flashbacks of leaving reality when fainting in a hyperconscious state. As a child and teenager, doctors could not diagnose this condition. I believe it had something to do with my inability to cope with the experience of separation from the source created by the culture I was raised in. I didn't mean to have this much. It was confusing, brutal, visceral. This propelled me to what could be understood as a link backward in time, to a time when I held strong atheistic beliefs, did not understand consciousness, had not awakened to the eternal nature of reality, was incredibly uncomfortable with the existential questions that science had not answered, yet had really dogmatically assumed answers anyway, and the cold reality that has been created around science. I felt a lock, and suddenly understood that I had crossed the point from which the trip could change to another point on the emotional spectrum. I could not let go of my ego, and everything negative I had ever thought about myself came flooding in like a tsunami. An entity appeared in front of my open eyes. She looked like some sort of African goddess, constantly morphing depending on how I felt about her. She was fractal everywhere I looked. She was telling me telepathically that she had complete control over me and would do with me whatever she wished. I had met her before in another DMT trip. She will leave if I overcome my problems. That's what she comes to me for. She is not evil, but this time she was telling me everything I didn't want to hear. I had to leave the room. 2 of my friends were in the room with me, not on DMT. I was experiencing extreme paranoia and felt that they hated me. I got up and said, "I've got to go." One of my mates just said, "I love you," to me as I started to walk, which did help me momentarily, but the African woman was far more powerful than anyone in the 3rd dimension. I went to my room. I could hear my mates talking, and everything they were saying was being distorted into violent and hateful words directed towards me. I laid down and decided that I must confront this all. I must experience it for everything that it is. As I moved through deeper levels of thought, I felt completely and absolutely disconnected from the universe. The woman was still there, speaking to me. I eventually reached the void and felt that I finally had found some truth. I could see the tiny point of light that facilitated my connection to the universe. It was so small. The size of an atom is an appropriate description. I felt my body becoming simply matter. I was leaving this body for good, or so I thought. I accepted this and told myself that the only thing that can be relied upon in the universe is its infinite nature and constant change. I could not be here forever. Time had extended itself in massive amounts. A second felt like a year, if you could even put it in linear terms. Eventually, things stabilized and the trauma of the trip started to wear off. I would come to understand later how this trip would benefit my evolution. It defined to me all of my negative subconscious beliefs. I believed that the DMT had been extracted in a way that caused a negative accumulation of energy. Perhaps the acacia was killed in the process. Perhaps the people making it did not respect the process. I don't know. I know that this DMT did feel very different to previous types of DMT I have smoked. I didn't get any higher knowledge on this trip. Or maybe I did. I bought a gram of DMT from my coworker and took 60 mg when I got home. My method of consumption was a little bit of ganja at the bottom, 60 mg of DMT crystals in the middle, with a little bit more ganja on top. 10:50 p.m., I packed the bowl up as described above and began preparing myself. In a minute, I would come to understand none of my preparation actually prepared me. 10:52 p.m., I hit the bong for as long as I can and set it down and hold in the smoke, waiting for it to kick in. I did not have to wait long. As soon as that thought passed, it kicked in instantly. I was definitely not ready for it, the sudden intensity of it. I thought I understood this a little bit, having read countless trip reports. In that instant, everything became hexagonal and had a blue, purple, gray, black tint to it. Then the loudest, most intense vibrational frequency was creeping up in volume to the point it was all I could hear. After what seemed like 30 minutes, everything then became fractal in nature. That's the best I can describe it, at least. My cat walked into my field of vision, and she was just a blurred geometrical object having no real meaning or shape. I could barely comprehend it was my cat. I looked at my Star Wars posters for a while, and they made no sense. But to be fair, in the state I was in, nothing actually made sense. I had a question after question racing through my mind, but there were no answers. I found this odd because of all the trip reports saying they met entities of the subconscious wherever you believe they reside. Then the question stopped and I started to freak the F out. I literally forgot to breathe, that when I started to dry heave for what seemed like an eternity. After that stopped, I still could not breathe. I kept thinking, this is what drowning must feel like. I literally felt as though I was going to die and there was nothing I could do about it. Then this extreme, horrifying feeling of terror and dread washed over me like a wave. I felt as though I was feeling not some entity's presence, but the devil inside me making his presence known. I took on a shadowy mass at the end of the hallway I was staring at. I was confronting the evil that can reside in all our hearts, and I have never been so scared in my entire life. By now, the visuals had changed to shooting spirals of white light, like the good in me was trying to fight off the devil inside me. Then the colors changed in the room. It was far more vibrant and had many more colors. But that soon faded back to the dark hues I mentioned earlier. This time, the hexagons were elongated and moving, sort of like the code in the Matrix. I felt like I was seeing the source code of space-time. It was far too much to comprehend, especially for my first time using this. All the while this was happening, my body did not exist. I could feel pants, but I could not see my hand touching them. It was a true out-of-body experience. I was still not having a good time, still struggling to catch my breath, which was slowly coming back to me. I then did the first thing that came to mind and yelled out to my brother, who was down the hall in his room. I yelled his name 3 or 4 times and he came out and immediately knew what to do. He kept repeating, "Breathe and just hold my hand." After what seemed to be 10 or 15 minutes of him being there, I slowly came back into reality. At this point, my eyes had been closed for a long time, as I just couldn't bear to confront the shadowy mass of my inner evil. I saw these beams of spiraling light again, and I had the urge to open my eyes. The glow coming from my brother seemed to bathe me in a warm, comforting light. He brought me back from ultimate despair. After I saw that, almost in an instant, everything looked normal. I still had a slight feeling of dread and my body felt very weak. I sat in my chair for a while after until I thought I could walk. I felt better and better as the minutes passed. I opened a bag of Cheddar Chex Mix and started digesting what I just went through. 11:04 p.m. The trip has now been over for about 7 minutes. All of what I experienced happened in just 5 minutes. I feel as though it could have been a bit longer, but I wanted it to end so badly that I believe I forced myself out of that realm and was subsequently able to call out to my brother for help getting all the way back into my body. My first thoughts about this was nothing made sense at all, but once I got out of it, it seemingly made perfect sense. I felt as though I better understand the evil within my heart and what it is truly capable of. I feel more in control of it now than I used to be. It used this terrifying experience to teach me something about myself, to teach me about the evil that can manifest in all of us and subsequently how to control it. Simply, I needed to fully confront it, which I did not. I was scared of it, but because of that, I have a new respect for it. I feel as though I need to do this again, to fully understand myself so I can truly break through past myself and get the answers to the questions I was asking in the first place. Looking back, it was the evil in me that prevented me from going any further, of that I am sure. I felt as though I was on the precipice of complete ego death and fully breaking through. It was the weird limbo state where I was not myself, but I was at the same time. Truly very difficult to describe, but I have to first conquer that evil before I can move forward. I am just not ready to hear the answers to my questions yet, and that is perfectly fine. It was nothing like what I could imagine. I have personally taken mushrooms and LSD many times, and have never ever had a bad trip. I gave myself a false sense of security thinking. Because I've taken high doses of both LSD and mushrooms, I am at least partially prepared for the experience of DMT. I was very wrong, and I subsequently had my first bad trip. I did not enjoy it at all. But the crazy thing is, now that it's over, it was also amazing and truly eye-opening. I couldn't fully comprehend it until it was over. I will say it didn't turn me off to DMT or psychedelics. One thing I fully realize and want to reiterate, this is not a substance to mess around with and do on a whim. I did it on a whim, and I paid a price, but also gained something in return. So first I would like to share a little bit of my history with drugs with you guys. I consider myself as experienced as it gets with psychedelics. I have tried DMT, 2CE, 2CI4, ACE, DMT, LSD, CT2, and many others. This was my 5th time trying smokable DMT. It was by far the most interesting experience I have had yet. With that being said, I will get to the story. I loaded an unknown amount into a clean crack pipe. I took one hit and held it for about 20 seconds. When I exhaled and looked at the smoke coming out of me, I realized I was F-ed up and was in for a wild ride. The smoke turned into your average colorful geometric patterns. From what I hear, I took one more hit after that and held it. I don't recall what happened for the next 5 minutes. When I came to, I screamed help to anyone who would listen. I was starting to panic for some reason. I had no recollection of what I had did and why I was feeling the way I did. For some reason, I thought I was dead. I ran to my older brother's room and started pounding on his door. He wouldn't answer, so I returned to the living room. This is when I started to become a little more aware of my surroundings. I asked my uncle what happened to me. He said, "I don't know, you smoked some Dempsters." Everything felt wrong. Things were full of color and everything looked like it was part of a pattern. My uncle was like, "I have to hear this one." Suddenly I thought he was the devil wanting to hear my side of the story about my death. I was looking at him as if I didn't trust him. I asked him, "Why do you look like that?" He asked, "Like what?" I couldn't explain, though. Within the next minute, I came back to my perspective. This is the second time I have had a death-like experience. The first time was when I was on 15 mg of 2CI. That time I thought my older brother was the devil. He asked about what was going on with me, much like my uncle did. Earlier this year, I sustained severe brain trauma due to a violent snowboarding accident. Both death-like experiences have happened after the trauma. I have to wonder if it's to blame. I think I am going to take a break from the psychedelic drugs. I've been doing them since age 16. I found this experience so fascinating because I have never came across one quite like mine. Back in about April or May of 2012, an associate of mine had whipped up a batch of some pure DMT. He had about 7.5 grams as a personal cache, and he got rid of the rest. We had taken it orally, mainly through vaporization, or by coating a bowl of cannabis with it. Through about a month or so of doing it this way, we decided to take it to the next level. He diluted it in with RO water and hydrochloric acid to stabilize the base. He injected me with roughly 1.15 nix, the dose that Strassman had used in his DMT trials. This is my story of the events. After the solution was fully injected, the belt on my arm was removed. I was slightly apprehensive of the dosage, but not scared or nervous. Needles don't scare me. Approx. 4 seconds after the belt was removed, it felt as if I was kicked in the diaphragm by a mule of sorts. I coughed. And as I leaned my head back, I watched as my vision of the subtly lit room was invaded from the outside in by a forming opalescent static. Then it was dark for a split second, before I was then torn by my center chakra out of my body. I began to soar out of the limits of our atmosphere, whizzing past moons and planets, going progressively faster and faster as the vibrations shook my soul to the very core. It was like a cacophony of static sound and low-frequency oscillators. As I began to slow down, I began to become slightly more conscious of my surroundings and, as if guided by a higher force, made my way towards a nebula of massive proportions resembling the Horsehead Nebula. I stopped in the middle of the plasmic forces of the gaseous mass, witnessing some of the greatest events in astrological science. Then off in the distance, a light began to shine, hazy at first, then brighter. I realized it was approaching me at a moderate speed, and the vibrations stopped. It was silent as I watched this fourth-dimensional tesseract of light approach and envelop me. I later identified this as the Metatron Cube. As it blinded me with heavenly light and ambient sound, I grew a sudden universal understanding. Yet to this day, I cannot comprehend entirely what it meant. Only fragments of a higher nature at work in an oroboratic state of space and time. I was then launched back to my body. Upon arriving, I opened my eyes to the most horrific scenario I've ever witnessed. I've never hallucinated black before in any hallucinogenic state. I've taken LSD over 60 times, mushrooms about a dozen times, mescaline, various 2C molecules, MDMA, etc. And I've never had a bad trip on any of these substances. But this was on a level of sheer terror I can't even fully comprehend. Unaware of my associate having dosed himself in a like manner, he had taken a slightly smaller dose. I began to state what I believed happened. "Something's wrong," I said. "I think I'm dying." And although claiming to have been completely deaf during this period of time, my associate had the sheer instinct to detect I was in distress and calm my tits. "No way, man. It's okay. You're going to be okay," he said. Both of our voices were distorted as run through a matrix filter, and around us the creeping black ichor I watched spread from floor to ceiling began to take upon a form in the corner. A looming, twisting figure with a 12 span of what I assume were wings, made entirely of the ichor. Its facial features distorted to the point of an unidentifiable blur. Yet I knew it was watching our every move, both physical and metaphysical. I identified it as death. I realized that I had died and that I was rejected from my spiritual state by a higher power, but that the escort was still active in his duties. My life in its entirety began violently flashing before my vision, shaking my vision. Memories of my childhood, I thought, long forgotten, began to become significant in this state. I thought of my mom and how angry she would be that this is how I would die. This thought made me violently ill, and my stomach lurched once, forcing me from my sprawled position to an upright one sitting on the couch I was on. I looked at my associate and mumbled, "Grab a bucket," but it was too late. I threw up the hamburger I had eaten prior to heading to my associate's house, and as we both stared at it, things began to become slightly clearer. Gaining the ability to consciously recognize objects became obvious. After I noticed the pickle sitting in the mess on the floor, the trip and the excitement began to leave myself and associate, and realizing what I had just done, my associate stood up and went to the bathroom to vomit himself and grab paper towels. Afterwards, we discussed our trips in great detail to each other as we smoked a bowl of lavender haze. I was foolish. I'd just acquired some DMT and was impatient to try it. I didn't know for sure the purity of the substance I had acquired, and instead of properly weighing a dose, I found I didn't have sensitive enough scales. I just tried to eyeball it. I was at home in my apartment, a safe and comfortable setting, but I had had a difficult week and was tired and not in the most positive frame of mind. I really should have waited until another time. I really should have known better. I took the DMT by sandwiching it between 2 layers of dried mint leaves in the bowl of a glass bong, filling the bong with smoke and taking it in one single hit, which I held in as long as I was able to. I've read the following back to myself a couple of times, and it doesn't really come close to describing what this experience was actually like, or how utterly overwhelming the feelings or terror and dread were. There are huge bits missing because I just don't know how to describe them or quite where they fit in, but it's the best I can do. I lay back on my couch, waiting for something to happen. For a moment, I thought I had failed to get a strong enough dose to experience anything, but very shortly, I felt a warm, glowy feeling and started to perceive some interesting fractal-type visuals. However, I was still very much in what I normally think of as reality at this point. Just as I began to think that this was as far as this experience would go, things changed suddenly and drastically. First, I felt my body instantaneously and completely disintegrate into an unknowable number of infinitesimally small particles. Then the walls of the room I was in rapidly expanded and blasted away. I knew I had broken through. I felt excited, happy, and euphoric. This did not last. As the walls of my room vanished away, I caught a glimpse of and was briefly inside of a vast purple-colored dome-like structure covered in fractal patterns. It felt like a beautiful and safe, if somewhat overwhelming, place to be. For some reason, I tried to speak. I don't recall what I wanted to say, but remember saying cup and being confused that this was not the word I intended, and I was instantly ripped away from it. Looking back, there was a clear sense that my being torn away was a direct result of my attempting to speak, and although I didn't acknowledge this at the time, I'm not able to clearly recall what the place I found myself in after that was like. I remember very briefly seeing the wall of my room again before a vertical white plane covered with a regular pattern of clearly defined black dots slammed across in front of it from one side, then from the other side, and then closed in on me. What little visual experience I had after that was incomprehensible and indescribable. I remember seeing the dot planes a few more times and know that I experienced other things in between seeing those, but am unable to recall those things in any meaningful way. Throughout all of this, there was an overwhelmingly loud sound which continually got louder. I remember experiencing complete terror and feeling that this was not at all the right place for me to be, that something was very, very wrong, and that I had made an awful mistake in taking this journey. I believed, with no doubt at all, that I had died. I remember feeling that there was some kind of consciousness or entity in that place, although I never saw it, which it seemed had pulled me there and wished to keep me there. It wasn't exactly malevolent, but it seemed to be enjoying or benefiting from my fear in some way. At this point, I began to quickly forget how I had come to this place, then who I was, then what concepts like who, I, and where even were until I no longer existed. The thing that used to be me kept trying to speak, although it had no concept of what speech or language were or what it was trying to do or why. The other entity in this place seemed to be trying to devour and subsume the non-me into itself. At this point, I remember non-me feeling only two things: complete, dreadful, all-consuming terror, and a desperate desire to grasp hold of some kind of idea of what I now know as, but was completely alien at the time, self, for what was an unknowable amount of time, at once seeming like mere moments and at once an eternity. Non-me struggled to grab a hold of an idea it did not understand. This was inscrutably difficult. Initially, non-me couldn't even conceive of what an idea was, never mind develop a specific one. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity of desperate mental grasping, non-me was finally able with great effort to say a single word. I don't know how many times non-me said this before progressing to I am, but it seemed uncountably huge. I am. This went on for a long, long while, my sense of self slowly returning. The entity, if there was such a thing, did not seem to wish me to leave, but also no longer appeared interested in trying to stop me. A rectangle appeared and resolved into a calendar on my wall. Other familiar objects in my apartment resolved themselves one by one. I felt my body again. There were walls, a door, I was on a couch. However, everything was still distorted, and I still did not know who or what I was. I am. Went on for some time until suddenly the epiphany came and I recalled my name. I am AJ. I was instantly back in reality and realized that I was triumphantly screaming this out as loud as I possibly could. I felt confused and bewildered for some time after that. Eventually, I got up to look at my clock. It took me a while to recall what time was or meant, but once I did, I could tell that this experience had taken roughly 15 minutes. It had felt like eternity. The effects didn't fully wear off for another half hour, my vision being distorted and my thoughts disjointed, but mainly being, I'm never doing that again. I felt confused and anxious for hours afterwards and barely slept that night. Ultimately, though, despite being horrible and not something I wish to repeat, I think this has been a positive experience. The main thing I have taken from this is a very strong sense of my own mortality and of how unaware I was of it before, despite thinking otherwise. And also a renewed feeling of how fortunate I am to have this existence, of who I am and of how glad I am to be who I am. I've been taught a hard, harsh lesson and already have a strong sense that I will grow from it. I can't categorically say that this will be my last visit to hyperspace. I'm deeply intrigued by the dome place I briefly saw before being taken away to whatever that was. But I think that it will be a great many years before I feel mentally grounded enough to venture there safely, if I ever do. While I'm glad of what I experienced last night, I do not ever want to go to that place again.
Like and subscribe.